It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Samsung C27HG70. If you're not familiar with my video reviews, or if you are, you'll know that they're pretty long. They're quite detailed, especially compared to lots of reviews you'll see on YouTube. That's just how I like to do things. I do try and keep them as brief as I can, without sort of skipping over important details, or what I feel are important details. There is a much longer and more detailed look at the monitor in written form. And there's a link to the written review in the description of the video. There's also a link to information and some other links that you can use to help support the work that we do on YouTube channel and also on our website. I'd like to sort of start the review by talking a bit about the external features of the monitor. The screen itself is curved. It has a 1800R curve, which is fairly steep, but it isn't an ultra wide screen or anything like that. It's only a 27-inch 16:9 monitor, so the curve isn't that pronounced. I explore it in more depth in the written review. There's a sort of a section of that dedicated to it, so I'd definitely take a look at that. It isn't very easy to show you the curve or the effect of the curve in a video. In fact, videos and photos tend to exaggerate the curve. Once you're actually sitting in front of the monitor, it becomes a sort of a subtle addition, one which I quite like, and I find that I adapt to very readily and I hardly notice it, but it does add a little bit of extra depth, which again I quite like. You know, if I just raise the camera a bit, you'll see sort of extent of the curve. So, I mean, you know, there is a bit of a curve. It's not massive. The stand design has a sort of, some people might call it a Y-shaped stand or penguin foot. It's fairly deep, and that's because of the stand neck design, the fully adjustable hinged stand neck design, which I'll come on to shortly. That allows you to swivel the monitor. You can swivel it a bit left and right. You can also adjust the height. It's at its maximum height at the moment, but you can lower it quite considerably. So it's now much lower to the desk. You also notice I've got the screen off, and you can probably see it might appear like a reflection on the video. I'm in a very bright room at the moment. That's sort of intentional, just so I can explain that this has a light matte screen surface, a light matte anti-glare screen surface. But once you've got the monitor on and you're using it and your room lighting is properly controlled, it's not really an issue. It handles glare well, but it also helps preserve the vibrancy of the monitor a bit better than some matte screen surfaces would. You can also adjust the screen so it's in portrait. I'm not going to do that because I've got it all connected up with cables at the moment and that sort of mess it up, but you can just you can have the screen in portrait. There's some images of that in the written review as well. From the side you can see the hinged arm design of the stand neck of the monitor, and this has a slightly peculiar method for height adjustment of the monitor. This is when the monitor is at its maximum height. If you want to lower the height, which is fairly easy to do if you just sort of grab the screen at the top and the bottom if you've got it on your desk, but as I've got a camera in one hand, I'm just going to push down here to show you. It lowers like that. And then the screen sits rather low to the desk. Exact measurements are found in the written review. And as you can see, the stand design does take up quite a lot of depth on the desk. And if you've got it higher up, there's also the slightly protruding cable tidy ring here as well. At the rear of the monitor, you can see the central stand attachment point. If you take the stand off, which involves removing this plastic ring here, then unscrewing the plate for the stand mount, there's also a VESA plate or VESA plate included in the package, which allows you to use an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA mount for the monitor instead, if you don't like the included stand. The port area is located beneath the attachment point. There's a port cover, as you can see here. Plastic detachable port cover. There's the joystick, the jog button to control the OSD here. Sort of blue, silver, shiny Samsung logo. And a K slot or Kensington lock slot. And also further OSD control buttons there. This is all explored in the OSD video. I've now removed the port cover so you can see the ports. There are two HDMI 2.0B ports which are compatible with AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs. There's DisplayPort 1.4, which is also compatible with AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs. There is a headphone jack, 3.5mm headphone jack, which also doubles as a service port, which is used in service centres. There's a microphone input and a microphone output jack, again 3.5mm. There are two USB 3.0 ports. The bottom one supports fast charging for connected devices, and there's a USB 3 upstream port as well. And the final input there, which is slightly different to the 32-inch model, is a DC input, which means that this monitor has an external power brick. I've got the monitor plugged in and switched on now. That's just so I can show you this ring, which you can activate in the OSD of the monitor. It's just a basic lighting feature, and you can see it from the rear of the monitor. It's not particularly bright. You can actually remove this plastic ring, which is quite difficult to do when the monitor's plugged in and in place, so I'm not going to do that now. And if you do that, it'll appear not exactly brighter, but it'll cover more of an area, and it won't appear like such a thin ring. And it's kind of a cool blue. I don't know what it'll look like on the video. It's a kind of a cool blue colour, a light blue colour. And there's also an inner ring of silver-coloured, blue silver-coloured plastic, very similar to the material used for the Samsung logo there, which kind of reflects it out a bit. But if you've got the monitor facing a wall, as I do on my desk, and I think most people would have on their desk in a normal situation, it's not particularly bright, so you can't think of it as a bias lighting feature or anything like that. It's just really to look cool if you look at the monitor from the rear. This monitor uses a Samsung SVA super vertical alignment panel with a 144Hz refresh rate and a 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution. Some people would refer to this resolution as 2K, which is mathematically incorrect, and it really annoys me. You can call it 2.5K if you really have to, but really it's best to just avoid using the term anything K to describe this resolution. Describing resolutions in that way was only a thing when 4K UHD resolution became a thing, whereas this resolution has been a thing for a lot longer than the 4K resolution. And if you think of the 4K UHD resolution, 3840 by 2160, the horizontal component of that, 3840, people round that up to 4K, that's fine, that's kind of where 4K comes from, to describe the UHD resolution at least. But half of that is actually 1920 by 1080 or full HD. So if anything's 2K, it would be the full HD resolution. And I'm not going to rant on about this for too long, but just don't use this this term 2K in my presence. It really annoys me. And if anyone makes a comment in the video and uses the term 2K to describe the resolution of this monitor, I will probably ban them from my channel. Now, with that out of the way, the 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution offers a good amount of real estate, and it offers a nice pixel density on a 27-inch screen like this. I actually personally prefer the pixel density of this kind of screen to the 31.5-inch version of this monitor. I feel that the slightly tighter pixel density is good in terms of the clarity when you're gaming or viewing images, and I just find text and other elements just look a bit clearer to me, a bit sharper, and I just prefer it. And anything bigger than 27 inches, for me, it has to really have a 4K UHD or high resolution, or 3440 by 1440 if it's an ultra wide. But anyway, the resolution is good. It's a good compromise for many people as well. It's easy to run. You get a good amount of real estate if you're just browsing the web or doing work as well. It gives you some decent multitasking potential if you're that kind of person. I mean, I prefer to just have one thing open at the same time and focus on that, unless I've got an ultra-wide monitor or multiple monitors or like 4K monitor. But with this resolution I find it really good for just, a single document or something like that. You can get plenty of information on the screen at once. Very good for productivity. I'm now going to talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. I'm using Dirt Rally here, which is a good test for contrast performance because some of the stages have very dark nights. It's not like that kind of foggy, washed out pseudo night that you get on some games. This is proper dark night. Now, even on the pause screen here, there are a few aspects I'd like to point out. Firstly, the screen surface, as I've mentioned, it is a light matte anti-glare screen surface, so it doesn't have the heavy smeary look to it. It doesn't look like someone's smeared moisturiser on the screen or sneezed on the screen or something like that, and you're looking at the image through this nice nasty smeary mess. It doesn't look anything like that, but it does look a little bit grainier than I've seen on some matte screen surfaces, including those used on Samsung VA panels that I've used recently. So it's not too bad, just a little bit grainy. Now, I'll start the game. The overall atmosphere, the overall contrast level is very good. The strength of VA, the main strength of VA panels, is indeed contrast, and this monitor looks distinctly VA-like to me. Even when I didn't know it was, I could quite easily tell it was a VA panel when I play games like this. The contrast between the dark surroundings and the bright areas, such as the lights on the car and that kind of thing, is really very good. The contrast performance isn't perfect. The static contrast is a lot higher than you'd get from any non-VA LCD panel, but the darkness doesn't look sort of pitch dark or anything like that, especially not in a dim room like I'm in at the moment. Especially towards the bottom of the screen, there's something I explain in more detail in the written review, VA glow. It's not like IPS glow, which is an obvious sort of bloom which extends and eats detail away at the image quite far up. It's sort of more restricted than that and more gentle, but it does slightly lighten dark shades towards the bottom of the screen as viewed from a normal viewing position. But further up the screen, detail levels are very relatively good. Another issue is black crush. That's something associated with the gamma handling of VA panels, and if you look at it straight on, as the camera is at the moment and as I am with my eyes at the moment, some very dark shades actually blend into black. They appear darker than they should, so you do lose some subtle distinctions. And the slightly curious thing is, if you're looking at those same shades sort of at peripheral regions of the screen, or you actually view the monitor from an angle, then the detail levels actually improve a bit. Perhaps that wasn't very easy to see on the video, but that's because perceived gamma does change along with viewing angle. There's a sort of decent viewing angle dependency on VA panels. But even so, as I've said, you don't get IPS glow. The static contrast is relatively strong, and unlike on TN panels, you don't get this kind of almost contrast gradient due to huge perceived gamma shifts down the screen. So overall, it definitely gives the strongest performance in my view. And I should really mention that the black crush, I'll just go inside the vehicle here. It's not anywhere near as bad as I've seen on some VA panels. The gamma on this one tracks quite close to 2.2 by default, which is where most users would want it to be. But the sort of smaller details, like the material details on the car dashboard, sort of smaller, more subtle details like that, are still visible. I mean, they're not as distinct as they could be, but on some monitors the black crush is so bad that you wouldn't even see those details at all. So it's not too bad in that respect, and overall the contrast performance is really good on this monitor. I'm now going to talk a bit about the colour reproduction of this monitor. This monitor uses a quantum dot backlight. That's one of the key sort of marketing terms you might hear associated with this monitor. What that means is the colour gamut extends beyond the usual sRGB colour space and actually covers 95%, according to Samsung, of DCI-P3. And I explore this a little bit more in the HDR section of the review. But what this means is it can potentially display all of the shades within the sRGB colour gamut, but it also gives a little bit of extra vibrancy. Most content like this, Battlefield 1, not running in HDR at the moment, is really designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, so shades do appear a little bit more saturated than they should, but it isn't like a wide gamut model, you know, a monitor with an Adobe RGB colour space running this sort of sRGB content. It doesn't look like a cartoon or anything like that. It just looks vibrant, it looks rich. I mean, some of the green shades should be a bit more muted than they are, and I can't show you it here, but some of the desert environments appear a bit too red. They have too much of a red hue, but it's not super intense or anything like that. I mean, on an Adobe RGB monitors, you will see that redness is just really distracting and almost painful to look at sometimes. So there's nothing like that. And the variety of colours is really good. The consistency of colours is good as well. You know, a weakness of VA panels such as this is they do have some perceived gamma shifts, which also mean that the saturation shifts at various points of the screen. I'll just move the camera slightly when I'm talking about this because it's very centred and it's quite far away from the screen, but a sort of normal viewing position with a monitor like this would be a bit closer and a bit further up as well, but you might not even be able to see on the video, but some of the green shades appear more intense centrally. The same shades appear less intense towards the flanks of the screen and lower down the screen as well. But it's not like a TN model where you have an obvious gradient of saturation where they look really quite washed out towards the bottom and overly deep towards the top. It's not that bad at all, but it doesn't have the consistency of IPS type panels where that same shade will appear pretty much the same no matter where it is on the screen. And when you're gaming, you don't generally notice this. And actually this model, as far as VA models of this size go, it's really good. In terms of colour consistency, at least for gaming. It's you know, it doesn't have any sort of issues that really smack you in the face, and because of the vibrancy from the quantum dot backlight, it doesn't really, you know, I don't think anyone would describe it as looking washed out. So it's nice. It gives a nice sort of colour experience. But if you're manipulating colours, you do photography or design work or that kind of thing, just be aware of these consistency issues, and they're explained in more detail in the written review as well. And I mean, in terms of the more vibrant elements like these sort of embers around the flying about the screen, fire in the background, that kind of thing, they have a lovely rich red orange quality to them, and that's the kind of the thing that people like about monitors like this, with fairly generous but not extreme colour gamuts. I've decided to add in a little bit of extra about the colour reproduction of the monitor. I know the whole point in doing a video is really to be able to sort of demonstrate things visually, and it's not always easy in a game to display or show things in an accurate way, especially with the camera on a tripod a bit far from the monitor and that kind of thing. So I've actually got the monitor off the tripod and I'm sort of having it in a position which is more typical to a user's eye line when they're using a monitor on the desk. Now some users prefer to be a bit lower down, sort of centrally. Some users sit a bit higher up. The ergonomically correct position for your eyes, you should actually have them a little bit above the centre line of the monitor, but either way, I want to just talk a bit more about the colour reproduction. Now, what my camera captures is very different to what I actually see. I should have really made more of a point about that earlier in the colour reproduction, because what you see on the video depends on my camera. It also depends on your own monitor and all the stuff in between that goes on YouTube and all of the video editing software and that kind of thing. But at least to my eyes, I can see, I mean, I'm not going to go through all of this because I've written it all down in the review, so the written review, so I'd just reference that instead. But some of these shades, actually the purple's probably the best to show this. Basically it appears quite a rich lilac colour in the middle, whereas lower down it has more of a pink hue, and again I don't know if this is going to come out on the video, and it has that same sort of pink hue towards the flanks as well. If you're sitting closer to the monitor, these differences become more pronounced. If you're sitting further away from the monitor, then they start to disappear. And it's all related to the viewing angle dependency of the gamma curve of the monitor, these saturation shifts I was talking about earlier. But again, if you're doing colour critical work, just be aware of this in particular. And if you move your head, you can actually see this pink hue move around with you. And it's this, maybe a clearer demonstration with the Lagom text, I'm not sure, I've never really tried this out on a video before. But basically you can see shifts, you can see that there's a sort of central area that's different to the rest of the screen, and that kind of shifts around as you move your head. These are all related to the gamma shifts on the monitor. So I'm not sort of pointing these out to say that it's a bad monitor or anything like that, but they exist with all VA panels, and if you are doing colour critical work you definitely have to be aware of those inconsistencies. I'm now going to talk a bit about HDR, or high dynamic range, and how it applies on this monitor. I'm going to keep this relatively brief. There's a nice section in the written review all about HDR and how it works on this monitor, and as I say in other sections of the review, you're not going to be able to see what I see firsthand or what you'd see firsthand using this monitor on a YouTube video. What you see depends on the camera, it depends on the software that I've used to edit the video, it depends on YouTube, and of course it depends on your own screen. So really I'm just going to use this, I'm going to show you Battlefield 1 running in HDR, but this is really just to sort of prompt me to discuss various different elements with you. If you're not familiar with HDR as it applies on a monitor, it basically means that the monitor can display a greater range of shades. It means that the colour gamut is wider than your sort of standard sRGB monitor, and also that those colours can be used appropriately. It also means the contrast of the monitor is superior to a normal monitor, and obviously when I say a normal monitor I mean a normal LCD monitor where usually the backlight is controlled as a single unit. On this particular monitor, Samsung doesn't actually specify the number of dimming zones it has, but my testing and other testing seems to confirm that 8 is the number of dimming zones it has, which, I mean, it doesn't sound like many for a monitor of this size, 27 inches, but as I'll discuss or show you, it does still make a nice positive difference to the HDR experience, and definitely beats just having one backlight all controlled at the same time. Of course, ideally, you'd have each pixel with its individual light source as you'd get on an OLED screen, or you get sort of maybe hundreds or thousands or even more dimming zones. That would allow the monitor to display sort of very intricate, very bright details whilst simultaneously showing very, very deep dark shades. But I'll stop waffling on too much about this and I'll just show you how this works on the monitor. So this scene here is quite a good demonstration of HDR. Again, you're not going to be able to see it on the video properly, but I can see here that this light here is very bright indeed, it's very intense, whereas further down the screen, sort of the weapon, for example, the screen's nice and dark there. The same for that sort of dark area. I mean, it doesn't go, you know, super dark for those areas because it's not trying to display pure black, so the backlight isn't kind of off completely in those zones, but it is definitely very deep compared to the area, the dimming zone, which controls this sort of bright area here. So that works nicely. The moon there again, also very bright. It's sort of, to be honest, it's akin to looking at the real moon in some ways. I've got the monitor on full brightness for the full HDR effect. And I mean, if the monitor was at a static brightness, for one thing, it can't actually go as bright as it's going for these particular bright elements. It reaches about 600 candela per meter squared. It can pulse the backlight to 600 candela per meter squared, which exceeds the normal sort of static maximum brightness, which is around 400, which is still really quite bright anyway. I should also mention it's not just about the extremes. I know I said these elements may be 600 candela per meter squared. They're not necessarily that bright. It's up to the game developers. Certainly as I look at this though, they do contrast very well with the dark areas and much better than they appear to with HDR disabled. But it's also about tone mapping. HDR on this monitor has very accurate and I should really say precise tone mapping. It supports 10 bits per subpixel, and that's one of the aims of HDR as well, and that means that the steps in brightness between the black and the white are also displayed very nicely as well, and it helps give you sort of distinctions, so it isn't just that everything's super bright. It's sort of the steps below that are nicely distinguished as well. And you can probably see even on the video the sort of the tone of that white compared to that. It's very distinctly different. That's very cool. That's very warm white. And as I said, it's not necessarily that they're 600 candela per meter squared or just a pure white, because they're not. As you can see, the tones are different. But certainly HDR, in terms of contrast on this monitor, it does bring some benefits. I'm now going to talk a bit about the other main aspect of HDR on this monitor and HDR in general, and that is colour reproduction. This monitor supports a colour gamut of DCI P3, 95% DCI P3 Samsung specifies, and the HDR standard only requires, or the HDR10 near-term standard requires 90%, so they've exceeded that, which is good. As I mentioned in the colour reproduction section, things look very vivid, very vibrant, but actually some shades appear oversaturated, more strongly saturated than they should. It's not extreme like it is on wide gamut models with Adobe RGB colour spaces when you look at this sort of untamed wide gamut content. But one of the things about HDR is it recognises that colour gamut, it uses that colour gamut appropriately. I mean, that depends on the content, it depends on how the developers do things. They can make things look very saturated if they want, they can make things look unrealistic if they want. But on this title, it actually tones down the saturation a bit. So the greens of the vegetation, there are still lots of nice deep lush shades, but the more muted pastel shades appear more appropriate, more realistic, more believable with HDR enabled. But that doesn't mean that the game looks washed out or anything like that. It just looks more natural, and there are plenty of vibrant shades included where the game developers want them. For example, explosions on this game. They have a really nice, vibrant, fiery quality to them, and things just appear with plenty of pop where they need to. These little flowers there look nice and vibrant as well, and because the colour gamut actually extends beyond sRGB, it allows the game creators to intentionally put in some more vibrant shades where they want to as well. So, I mean, overall, to me, the colours look nicer in HDR. So it's not just about the contrast, the colour reproduction is improved as well. To actually map things more accurately to that gamut, as I've already mentioned, the monitor supports 10-bit colour processing per channel, and that's that's a requirement of HDR, especially when you're working with these wide colour gamuts. And it isn't something that this monitor supports, and it isn't something that any current commercially viable backlight solution supports. But the ultimate goal is actually a much wider colour gamut than even this can support, something called Rec 2020, huge colour gamut. So in the future we can look forward to an even greater palette of colours being used. But even at the moment, I'm quite pleased with the sort of addition that the wider colour gamut properly used brings to HDR on monitors like this. I'm now going to talk a bit about the responsiveness of the monitor. It features a 144Hz panel, and the game I'm now running, Battlefield 1, is running at 144 frames a second. What this means is the monitor can deliver over twice the visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor. One thing that does is it makes the interactions with the game feel a lot smoother. As you're using your mouse in particular, you'll feel that. It gives you what I call a greater connected feel with the game world. It's definitely something you really have to experience for yourself to understand. You won't be able to see exactly what the monitor looks like on the video. It's more limited in frame rate, the video. Your own monitor may well be more limited in refresh rate. And of course it depends on all the other things which I've already mentioned. And for the most part the monitor makes good use of that refresh rate. A lot of the pixel responses are fast enough to give an optimal performance at that refresh rate. There are some weaknesses. Anyone who's seen my video reviews before will know that I love this scene on Battlefield 1 of pointing out some of the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, especially on VA models. That's because it has a lot of darker transitions which VA models struggle with, and this is certainly no exception in that regard. I'm just going to highlight a few of the weaknesses before again talking a bit about the strengths of this monitor. You can see, or hopefully you can see on the video, I'm not entirely sure if it'll come out properly, but there's a kind of what I call breakup trailing. If you look at the horse's mane, or if I look at the horse's mane and you look at this little thing there, you can see little flashes of purple which kind of bleed out of the main colour. These shades are actually contained within the object. The horse's mane, for example, it actually contains these kind of bluey purple shades. They're very dark, so it just looks more or less like black on the object itself, but in the trail it actually manifests itself. It kind of bleeds out as a more colourful trailing, and that is something that some people find quite eye-catching and annoying. Other people don't really notice it and don't mind. It's very subjective. You can also see it on these rocks. Some of the kind of red hues bleed out of the rocks as well. I mean, there are some more examples of this sort of behaviour. If you wanted to see a really bad example of a VA model in terms of responsiveness, take a look at the video review of the Philips BDM 4037. That has really widespread smeary trailing, and it's really quite ugly, and I can't bear to game on it. This model I can bear to game on, and I'm not saying it doesn't have weaknesses. I mean, I'm highlighting some of the weaknesses here, but it's not really it's far from the worst VA model I've used. You can also see some sort of smeary trailing on these things, these little pieces of rock there against the sky. I'm not sure again if that'll come out in the video, but they're all due to the pixel responses for these pixel transitions being slower than they should be, and they are noticeably slow. So, you know, whilst this isn't the weakest VA model I've used by a long shot, it's not the strongest either. I'd say the AOC that I've just recently reviewed, the AG322QCX, that has better pixel overdrive tuning. This model, you have to have it on the standard response time setting if you want it to use its sort of normal non-strobe backlight mode, and I'll come on to that in a minute. With the AOC there were various other options, and some of them just offered slightly better performance, I feel. It's not a massive difference, but you know, it is a bit of a difference. And you can see some more of this sort of smeary trailing there as well. I mean, I think you get the idea. And again, it's something that some people notice and find bothersome. Other people notice and don't find it bothersome. Other people don't really notice it when they're just playing the game. So again, it's very subjective. There's also a bit of overshoot on this model, just a little bit. I mean, I don't find it as obvious as the sort of the smeary trailing I've just pointed out. You can see it at the top of these telegraph wires as sort of a semi-transparent trailing, that's overshoot. There's also a bit of kind of overshoot and a bit of conventional trailing here as well. And I mean, I can probably show you plenty of other examples of this sort of bleedy, smeary trailing behind the rocks there, kind of a silhouette. So, I mean, those are the weaknesses. And as I've said, most of the pixel transitions, if you're playing in the daytime, most of the lighter pixel transitions with lighter shades are pretty fast. There's sometimes a little bit of a sort of powdery trailing, and it does add a bit to the perceived blur, but for the most part it does a good job at pumping out good pixel responses for the 144 Hz refresh rate. It also offers very low input lag, so in terms of the connected feel I was talking about, that really enhances that element as well, and it goes nicely with that. Another trick up this monitor's sleeve is support for AMD FreeSync, and this is something I'm going to have to activate because I've just been running this game so it's a solid 144 frames a second, and I've had FreeSync off. I mean, it doesn't matter if I turn it on, it doesn't change the response behaviour at this particular frame rate, but I'll just, before turning FreeSync on, the reason I haven't turned it on is I wanted to talk briefly about the strobe backlight mode. You're not going to be able to see this on the video at all, other than the fact you may see it flickering. If you change the response time setting to either faster or fastest, you can see the flickering on the video probably quite clearly right now. It activates a strobe backlight mode. That greatly reduces the perceived blur. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about that in the video. It's covered in detail in the written review, and we've also got an article on monitor responsiveness which explores this in detail. But some of the weaknesses I noted just before without the strobe backlight, impulsive scanning as it's called, enabled, they still exist, and there is sort of more widespread overshoot in fact. So it's not really the cleanest performance I've seen from a strobe backlight mode, but it is there if you want to use it. Now I'm going to talk about FreeSync, so I'm going to deactivate that, activate FreeSync. I've now enabled AMD FreeSync. This is a variable refresh rate monitor that users of certain AMD GPUs can activate on the monitor. It allows the monitor to adjust its refresh rate dynamically to adjust the frame rate of the content, and this avoids the tearing or stuttering which you get depending on if you've got VSync on or off, which occurs when you're not using FreeSync or an alternative variable refresh rate technology such as G-Sync, which I should clarify this monitor does not support. The frame rate, I've increased the graphics settings slightly, they're still pretty low. The frame rate, you're probably not going to be able to see that very clearly, but it's not 144 frames a second anymore. It's dropped to, it sort of fluctuates around between 120, 109. So basically it's dropped a bit. Without FreeSync on, you'd see tearing if you had VSync disabled, and you'd also see juddering with VSync disabled, or with VSync enabled you would see stuttering. And these can be quite jarring. I find them really quite jarring. Sensitivity again to that does vary. Not everyone finds it as bothersome, and therefore don't actually find FreeSync as much of a sort of godsend as other people. But I do really like the technology. But it's not sort of a silver bullet, although it stops the tearing and the stuttering I just mentioned, which occur from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. You can still get stuttering and stuff from network latency and issues with other aspects of your computer as well. But the actual lower frame rate itself, it's sort of closer to 100 frames a second at the moment. You do notice a decrease to that connected feel that I was talking about before. This occurs regardless of whether FreeSync's enabled or not. And you also notice an increase in perceived blur. That's because with the frame rate decreasing, your eyes move more, your eye movement's increased. This is all explained in the written review a bit better. Again, I'm not going to waste too much time explaining it here. But it just basically means that you see more blur when you're moving your character around on the game. Now, I'm going to increase the settings a little more. And obviously the settings I've got here, what you can use and the frame rate you get will depend on your system and your graphics card. I'm not using a particularly powerful graphics card at the moment to test the AMD FreeSync. I've just got a Radeon R9 290, so I'm going to increase this a bit more. The frame rate now is dropping a little bit below 100. One thing that I notice quite frequently on FreeSync monitors such as this, which is a bit better on G-Sync monitors in my experience, the FreeSync monitors, they don't tend to tune the pixel overdrive as well for the lower refresh rates. They tend to kind of work best at high refresh rates, particularly like very high refresh rates, sort of in this case 120 hertz plus. But with the monitor reducing its refresh rate to sort of 100 hertz and below that, I start to notice more obvious overshoot. And you probably won't be able to see this on the video, and I can't get any particularly good examples. Actually, there's quite a lot of overshoot behind the vehicle here. I don't know if you can see that on the video, but it's quite noticeable to me. And actually the frame rate here has dropped to a bit lower. It's closer to sort of 80 frames a second, and this overshoot becomes even more noticeable as it drops below 80. I mean, it's not a hard and fast sort of rule with that number, just more or less as it reduces a bit, the overshoot becomes even more obvious. If you've got FreeSync disabled, your monitor will just stick to, say, 144 Hz. You don't actually get this. It's not tied to the frame rate, it's tied to the refresh rate. So without FreeSync, you don't get this effect. So it's a bit of a sort of issue which I commonly see on FreeSync models. And this one's quite bad in that respect, actually. I'm just going to increase the graphics settings further. It hasn't done an awful lot to the frame rate. It's sort of dropped it a little bit to 70, and again the overshoot's becoming even more obvious now. However, if I increase the resolution scale setting, I should be able to really kill the frame rate, which is good, because I'm going to talk a little bit about something called LFC. That stands for low frame rate compensation. It's a sort of feature associated with AMD FreeSync. This monitor is now running at, the game is now running at 40 frames a second. However, the monitor doesn't just stay at doesn't just stay at 48 Hz, which is the lowest, which is the floor of operation for FreeSync on this monitor. If you go on the information section, you can actually see it's running at 80 Hz. So it sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that keeps stuttering and tearing at bay as well. This model, I should actually have mentioned, as it says there, it does actually support AMD FreeSync 2. That's to do with the fact it combines HDR capabilities as well with the normal FreeSync capabilities, and it's a bit stricter in terms of the refresh rate range that's required, but unfortunately, as I've pointed out, it doesn't have any more stringent standards with respect to lower levels of overshoot or anything like that. To quickly wrap up the review, I mean quickly, I don't even have my tripod out at the moment, the monitor offered a fairly unique experience in that it offers a 27-inch VA panel with a 2560 by 1440 resolution. Furthermore, it has a 144 Hz refresh rate. I quite enjoyed this sort of combination of features myself. I prefer the tighter pixel density of this model over the 31.5-inch one, although I can see that some users would prefer a larger screen. The curve of the monitor was pretty subtle. It was, I feel, a nice addition, but not something that really massively changed the experience either way. The sort of the build quality of the monitor is decent. I'm not too fond of the fact that the stand base is quite deep. I would have preferred to have the monitor a little bit further back on my desk if it was an option, and my desk's actually quite deep as well. I just prefer the monitor to be a bit further back. As a VA panel, the main strength of this monitor is its contrast, and in that respect it's a little bit weaker than some older VAs I've used in particular, but pretty much in line with a lot of modern VA panels I've used, and that is to say it is noticeably better than other panel types in that respect, and it has a distinct VA-like experience to the contrast performance. The colour performance was pretty pleasing on the whole. The colour consistency as far as VA panels go was very good. It does have some weaknesses due to perceived gamma shifts and saturation changes, as all VA panels do to a degree. They weren't too bad on this model, and the colour gamut was pretty wide. It's quoted by Samsung as 95% DCI P3, and my instrument, the Spider 5 Elite, which tends to sort of underreport the gamut. Even with that, it was clearly quite a lot of extension beyond sRGB. That's the quantum dot backlight in action there. It gives you a wider colour gamut, extends the vibrancy. It does give a little bit of oversaturation in places. Coming on to the colour gamut itself, to make the best use of that, the content has to be specifically written for that kind of colour gamut, and that's where HDR comes in. The HDR capabilities of this monitor, I was quite sceptical before using it, but I actually found that the local dimming of the backlight, even with relatively few zones, worked quite well to enhance the contrast, and I also liked the way that the colour gamut could be more accurately mapped to get rid of some of the oversaturation and still maintain lots of nice vibrant shades, which are well beyond what any sRGB monitor could display. Responsiveness, it made good use of the refresh rate overall. It had a really good connected feel. Most of the pixel transitions were fast enough for sort of an optimal 144 Hz performance at high frame rates, but there were some weaknesses. There were always weaknesses with VA models. This was no exception. It was a little bit weaker than some of the VA models I've used, such as the AOC AG322QCX, but it's not a huge difference. It's much closer to that than something like the Philips BDM 4037UW, which, as you can see on my YouTube videos, was just a massive smeary mess. This model wasn't like that at all. Some users would find the weaknesses bothersome, but there's nothing you can do about that. The input lag was very pleasing as well. Support for AMD FreeSync, that's good. That did its thing. AMD FreeSync 2 on this model, because it combines it with HDR features. LFC, low frame rate compensation, was working just fine on this model as well. The only issue, and it's an issue I have found on other FreeSync compatible displays, is that the overshoot tended to become a lot more noticeable at lower refresh rates. So if you've got FreeSync active, that means if the frame rate of the game drops, you get a lot more noticeable overshoot, which I found a bit unsightly, to be honest. And it's something that G-Sync models tend to do better. If you're not using FreeSync, either because you've got an NVIDIA GPU or you choose not to, or whatever, then you're not going to have that issue. It's tied to the refresh rate, not the frame rate. There's not a lot more to say about this monitor, really. Just I feel it's an interesting product because of its combination of refresh rate, panel type and screen size. And as with all monitors, it is not perfect. So be sure to check out the full written review and other links with information about how you can support our work in the description of the YouTube video. And thank you for listening to me drone on for a very long time about this monitor.